The morning sun cast long shadows across the training compound as Maria Santos adjusted her gear one final time. The Special Operations training course had already claimed half of the original candidates, and today marked the beginning of the most brutal phase yet: close quarters combat evaluation. The kind of test that separated the truly elite from those who merely thought they belonged. Maria had grown up in East Los Angeles, where survival meant learning to fight before you could properly tie your shoes. Her father, a Marine veteran who lost his leg in Afghanistan, had taught her that respect was earned through action, not given through sympathy. When neighborhood boys twice her size tried to intimidate her, she learned to use their overconfidence against them. When recruiters dismissed her application to Special Forces training, she simply trained harder and applied again. Now, at 24, she stood among the final 18 candidates. The only woman left in a program designed to break even the strongest men. Her 5'6" frame drew skeptical looks from instructors and candidates alike, but Maria had stopped caring about their opinions weeks ago. Results spoke louder than prejudice. Sergeant First Class David Morrison commanded the training area with the authority of a man who had earned his reputation through 15 years of combat deployments. His scarred knuckles and cold eyes told stories of close-quarters battles in places most people couldn't find on a map. Morrison had built his career on the principle that weakness was a disease that could spread through a unit like infection. He had no patience for candidates who couldn't meet his standards. "Listen up," Morrison's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Today we evaluate your hand-to-hand combat proficiency. This isn't a sparring match. This isn't a game. In real operations, hesitation gets you killed. Weakness gets your teammates killed." The 18 candidates formed a loose semicircle around the matted training area. Maria noticed how the others unconsciously positioned themselves with extra space around her, as if her presence somehow contaminated their masculine solidarity. She had grown accustomed to this isolation. It no longer bothered her. If anything, it sharpened her focus. Morrison paced in front of them, his boots striking the concrete with military precision. "Each of you will demonstrate your capabilities against multiple scenarios. Unarmed combat against an armed opponent. Defense against superior size and strength. Tactical thinking under physical pressure." He stopped directly in front of Maria, his 6'3" frame casting a shadow over her position. "Some of you think Special Operations is about following protocols and checking boxes. You believe that meeting minimum standards somehow entitles you to wear the uniform." Maria met his gaze without flinching. She had learned long ago that showing fear only encouraged bullies to push harder. "Special Operations demands perfection," Morrison continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that only she could hear. "It demands warriors who can perform miracles under impossible conditions. It doesn't care about your feelings, your background, or your diversity statistics." The other candidates shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension but uncertain how to respond. Maria remained motionless, her breathing steady and controlled. She understood what Morrison was doing. He was testing her psychological resilience before the physical evaluation even began. "Candidate Santos," Morrison announced loudly, stepping back to address the group. "You'll demonstrate first." Maria moved to the center of the training mat without hesitation. She had expected this. Being singled out was part of the process, and she had prepared mentally for every possible scenario. Morrison gestured to a rack of training weapons. "Select your opponent's equipment." This was unusual. Typically, instructors determined the parameters of each exercise, allowing the candidate to choose introduced variables that could complicate the evaluation. Maria studied the available options: rubber knives, training pistols, batons, and flexible restraints. She selected a rubber knife and a set of zip-tie restraints. "Ready, Sergeant." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Most candidates would choose the least threatening options to improve their chances of success. Maria had deliberately selected tools that would make her task more difficult. "Candidate Thompson." "Candidate Rodriguez," Morrison called out. "You're the aggressors." Thompson was built like a linebacker, with shoulders that seemed to span half the mat. Rodriguez moved with the fluid grace of someone who had trained in martial arts since childhood. Both men outweighed Maria by at least 60 pounds. "Rules are simple," Morrison explained. Aggressors attempt to restrain the defendant using any means necessary. Defendant must neutralize both threats and secure the weapons. Exercise continues until completion or medical intervention becomes necessary. Maria positioned herself in the center of the mat, analyzing her opponent's positioning and probable attack strategies. Thompson favored his right side, suggesting an old injury or dominant hand preference. Rodriguez distributed his weight evenly, indicating formal training and balanced skill development. The exercise began without ceremony. Thompson charged forward with the subtlety of a freight train, attempting to use his size advantage for an overwhelming tackle. Rodriguez circled left, knife held in a reverse grip, clearly planning to attack after Thompson engaged. Maria sidestepped Thompson's charge and used his momentum to redirect him past her position. Before Rodriguez could capitalize on the opening, she closed the distance between them, staying inside the knife's effective range. Her elbow struck his wrist with surgical precision, causing him to drop the weapon. Thompson recovered faster than she had anticipated. His massive arms wrapped around her torso from behind, lifting her feet off the ground. This was the moment most female candidates failed. When brute strength overwhelmed technique, panic typically followed. Maria drove her heel into Thompson's instep, while simultaneously throwing her head back into his nose. The combination loosened his grip enough for her to slip free and roll away from both opponents. The exercise continued for another 3 minutes. Maria systematically dismantled their attacks, using their aggression against them. When Thompson grabbed for her again, she used his forward momentum to throw him across the mat. When Rodriguez attempted a leg sweep, she turned it into a takedown that left him gasping for breath. Finally, she stood over both men, the knife and restraints secured in her hands. Neither opponent was seriously injured, but both had been thoroughly dominated by someone they outweighed by a significant margin. The watching candidates stared in stunned silence. Most had assumed Maria's presence in the program was some kind of administrative error or social experiment. None had expected to witness such a complete demonstration of technical superiority. Morrison's expression remained unreadable as he approached the center of the mat. "Adequate technique," he said dismissively, "but you relied too heavily on your opponent's mistakes. Against truly skilled adversaries, such tactics would prove insufficient." Maria nodded respectfully, though she disagreed with his assessment. She had neutralized both threats efficiently, without causing unnecessary injury. By any objective measure, her performance had been flawless. However, Morrison continued, his voice taking on a more challenging tone, "Theory and practice often differ significantly. Let me demonstrate the level of aggression you'll face in real combat situations." He moved onto the mat with predatory confidence, his movements suggesting decades of close-quarters combat experience. This was not part of the standard evaluation protocol. Maria realized that Morrison was personalizing the exercise, turning it into something between a test and a vendetta. "Same rules apply," he announced to the group. "Except now, the stakes are real." Thompson and Rodriguez retreated to the edge of the mat, both grateful to be spectators rather than participants. The other candidates formed a tighter circle, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Morrison was not carrying training weapons. He approached empty-handed, but his positioning and stance suggested he considered himself weapon enough. At 220 pounds of muscle and experience, he probably wasn't wrong. The first exchange happened almost too quickly to follow. Morrison closed the distance with professional efficiency, attempting to establish dominant position through superior size and strength. His initial grab was perfectly executed, designed to control Maria's center of gravity while limiting her mobility options. For a moment, it seemed like the inevitable outcome was unfolding. Morrison's hands locked around her shoulders, and he began applying pressure that would force most opponents to submit or risk serious injury. Then Maria did something unexpected. Instead of fighting against his grip, she moved with it, using his own force to create an angle he hadn't anticipated. Her right hand found the pressure point behind his left elbow, while her left leg swept his supporting ankle. Morrison's eyes widened as he realized his position had been compromised, but his experience allowed him to adapt quickly. He shifted his weight and attempted to drive Maria to the ground, planning to use his size advantage to pin her against the mat. This was exactly what Maria had been waiting for. As Morrison committed to the takedown, she twisted in his grasp and used his momentum to redirect his trajectory. Instead of landing on top of her, he found himself sailing over her position and crashing onto the mat with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. The impact echoed across the training area like a gunshot. Morrison lay motionless for several seconds, stunned by the unexpected reversal. Maria rose smoothly to her feet, her breathing only slightly elevated despite the intensity of the exchange. Around the mat, 18 candidates and 3 other instructors stared in absolute silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The moment stretched until it became almost unbearable. Morrison rolled onto his side and pushed himself to his hands and knees, shaking his head to clear the fog. When he looked up at Maria, his expression had transformed from dismissive confidence to something much more dangerous. "Impressive," he said quietly, climbing to his feet with careful dignity. But that was just the beginning. Maria maintained her ready position, knowing that Morrison's pride had been wounded, and that wounded pride could make even professional soldiers unpredictable. She watched his hands, his feet, his shoulders, looking for the telltale signs that would telegraph his next attack. But instead of advancing, Morrison began circling her position like a predator, evaluating its prey. His movement was patient, methodical, designed to build psychological pressure while he planned his next assault. "You think you've proven something," he said, his voice carrying across the silent training area. "You think one lucky throw makes you special operations material." Maria didn't respond. Verbal jousting was a distraction she couldn't afford. Morrison was testing her mental discipline as much as her physical skills. "In Afghanistan," Morrison continued, still circling, "I watched tough guys break when the real fighting started. Size, strength, training, none of it mattered when the bullets started flying and their buddies started dying." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the old scars on his knuckles and the calculating intelligence in his eyes. Morrison's second attack came with the brutal efficiency of a man who had killed enemies with his bare hands. His approach was different this time, more calculated, more vicious. He feinted left before driving forward with his right shoulder, attempting to tackle Maria around the waist while simultaneously trapping her arms against her sides. The impact drove both of them toward the edge of the mat. Morrison's weight and momentum should have been overwhelming, but Maria managed to maintain her balance long enough to attempt another defensive maneuver. She pivoted on her left foot and tried to use his forward motion to throw him past her position again. This time, Morrison was ready for it. He had studied her previous technique and adapted his approach accordingly. As Maria began her throw, he shifted his center of gravity and wrapped his arms more tightly around her torso. Instead of being redirected, he maintained his grip and used his superior weight to drive her backward. Maria felt her feet leave the ground as Morrison lifted her off balance. For a split second, she was completely airborne, her defensive options drastically limited. Morrison's experience showed as he controlled the takedown, ensuring that she would land hard while he maintained dominant position. The impact against the mat drove the air from Maria's lungs and sent shockwaves through her spine. Morrison's 220 pounds landed on top of her with crushing force, pinning her flat against the training surface. His forearms pressed against her throat while his knees trapped her legs, establishing the kind of dominant position that typically ended close-quarters combat exercises immediately. Around the training area, the watching candidates shifted uncomfortably. Several instructors moved closer to the mat, clearly concerned that the exercise had escalated beyond appropriate training parameters. The silence was broken only by the sound of Maria's labored breathing as she struggled against Morrison's weight. "This is what real combat looks like," Morrison announced to the group, his voice steady despite the physical exertion. "When technique fails, when luck runs out, when you're overpowered by a superior opponent." Maria's vision began to blur as the pressure against her throat restricted blood flow to her brain. Morrison's positioning was textbook perfect. She had no leverage, no escape routes, no realistic chance of reversing their positions through conventional means. But Maria Santos had not survived East Los Angeles by following conventional wisdom. In the neighborhood where she grew up, fights were not sporting events with rules and referees. They were survival exercises where creativity mattered more than technique and desperation could overcome superior strength. Instead of fighting against Morrison's grip, Maria relaxed her entire body and stopped struggling. To the watching candidates, it appeared that she was submitting to the inevitable. Morrison himself seemed to interpret her stillness as acceptance of defeat. Strength matters, he continued his lecture, loosening his grip slightly as he assumed the exercise was over. Size matters. Experience matters. No amount of political correctness changes these fundamental realities. That moment of overconfidence created the opening Maria needed. As Morrison's pressure decreased, she explosively drove her right knee upward while simultaneously twisting her shoulders in the opposite direction. The combination created just enough space for her to slip her left arm free from his control. Morrison realized his mistake immediately, but by then, it was too late. Maria's free hand found the nerve cluster at the base of his neck, applying pressure with surgical precision. The technique was not part of standard military training. She had learned it from her father, who had acquired it during specialized close-quarters combat instruction in Afghanistan. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Morrison's entire left side went temporarily numb, causing him to lose his balance and roll off her position. As he struggled to regain control of his motor functions, Maria rolled in the opposite direction and came to her feet in one fluid motion. For several seconds, Morrison lay on the mat, his left arm and leg twitching as the nerve disruption slowly subsided. The watching candidates stared in stunned disbelief as their seemingly invincible instructor struggled to coordinate his movements. Maria stood over him, her breathing controlled despite the intensity of their exchange. She made no move to press her advantage or inflict additional damage. Instead, she simply waited for Morrison to recover, demonstrating the kind of professional restraint that distinguished special operations personnel from common soldiers. "Interesting technique," Morrison managed to say as sensation returned to his extremities. He rolled onto his side and pushed himself to his hands and knees, clearly struggling with both physical discomfort and wounded pride. "My father taught it to me," Maria replied calmly. "He said it was useful when size and strength aren't enough." Morrison climbed slowly to his feet, testing his balance and mobility as full control returned to his nervous system. His expression had evolved from dismissive confidence, through shocked surprise, to something approaching grudging respect. "Your father," he said, brushing dust from his uniform. "What unit?" "Sings de Hirasho Sho." "With Markar. 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. 3 tours in Afghanistan before an IED took his leg." The information seemed to register with Morrison in a way that transcended their current confrontation. The military community was smaller than most civilians realized, and combat veterans shared bonds that crossed traditional boundaries. "I knew some men from 2nd Battalion," Morrison said quietly. "Good Marines. They knew how to fight." He turned to address the watching candidates, his voice regaining its authoritative edge despite his obvious physical discomfort. "What you just witnessed demonstrates several important principles. First, overconfidence kills. Second, technique can overcome physical disadvantages. Third, adaptability matters more than size." Although Maria remained at attention, uncertain whether the exercise was officially concluded or whether Morrison intended to continue. His pride had been damaged publicly, and she understood that some men could not tolerate such humiliation without seeking revenge. However, Morrison continued, his eyes returning to Maria. "Technique alone is insufficient. In real combat situations, you don't get timeout periods to recover. Your enemies don't respect your personal space. They don't stop attacking because you've demonstrated superior skills." He moved back onto the mat, his movements more cautious now but still radiating professional menace. "They keep coming until one of you is dead." This time, Morrison approached with the calculated aggression of a man who had learned from his mistakes. He understood Maria's capabilities now, respected her technical skills, but remained convinced that sustained pressure would eventually overwhelm her defensive advantages. Their third engagement was different from the previous two. Morrison no longer relied solely on size and strength. Instead, he combined his physical advantages with tactical intelligence, varying his attack patterns and forcing Maria to defend against multiple threat vectors simultaneously. For nearly 2 minutes, They moved across the mat in a deadly dance of attack and counterattack. Morrison's experience showed in his ability to maintain pressure without creating the kinds of openings that Maria had exploited earlier. His positioning was perfect. His timing was impeccable, and his conditioning allowed him to sustain maximum aggression without fatigue. Maria found herself being systematically pushed toward the edge of the mat. Morrison's strategy was working. He was using his superior strength to limit her mobility, while his technical skills prevented her from establishing dominant positions. Then Morrison made a critical error. In his determination to finish the exercise decisively, he overcommitted to a takedown attempt that left him momentarily off balance. Maria recognized the opportunity immediately and exploited it with ruthless efficiency. Her counterattack was a masterpiece of applied physics. Instead of opposing Morrison's forward momentum, she redirected it upward and sideways, using his own energy to launch him into an involuntary somersault that sent him crashing into the equipment rack at the edge of the training area. The impact was spectacular. Morrison's body struck the metal rack, with enough force to send training weapons scattering across the concrete floor. The rack itself tilted dangerously before toppling over entirely, creating a cacophony of metallic crashes that echoed throughout the training compound. Morrison landed in a heap among the scattered equipment, his uniform torn and his dignity completely shattered. Around the training area, candidates and instructors alike stared in absolute silence at the scene of destruction. Maria remained in the center of the mat, her breathing slightly elevated but her composure intact. She had not pursued Morrison after throwing him, demonstrating the kind of tactical restraint that separated professionals from amateurs. For several long moments, the only sound was Morrison, groaning as he extracted himself from the wreckage of the equipment rack. When he finally managed to stand, his uniform was disheveled, his face was flushed with embarrassment, and his authority had been thoroughly undermined. "Exercise concluded," announced Colonel Patricia Hayes, the senior training officer who had arrived to investigate the commotion. Her appearance suggested that news of the confrontation had reached the command structure faster than anyone had anticipated. Morrison straightened his uniform and attempted to recover some measure of professional dignity. "Yes, ma'am." Candidate Santos demonstrated adequate technical proficiency under pressure. Colonel Hayes studied the destruction around the equipment rack, then looked at Maria, who remained at attention in the center of the mat. "Adequate?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Morrison realized that his assessment sounded absurd given the evidence surrounding them. But backing down now would only compound his humiliation. "She shows promise," he amended carefully. "With additional training and experience, she might develop into acceptable special operations material." Colonel Hayes raised an eyebrow at this evaluation. She had observed the entire confrontation from the window of the command building, and her assessment differed significantly from Morrison's diplomatic summary. "Sergeant Morrison," she said formally, "you are dismissed. Report to medical for evaluation, then to my office for debriefing." Morrison's face reddened further as the implications of her orders became clear. Being dismissed in front of the candidates was professionally humiliating. Being ordered to medical suggested that his injuries were more serious than his pride wanted to admit. "Yes, ma'am," he replied stiffly, then turned toward the other candidates. "Continue with individual evaluations. Demonstrate what you've learned." As Morrison limped away from the training area, Colonel Hayes approached Maria's position. The contrast between the two women was striking. Hayes represented 20 years of successful military leadership, while Maria embodied the potential of the next generation. "Candidate Santos," Hayes said quietly, "that was an impressive demonstration. However, humiliating instructors is not typically part of our training curriculum." Maria maintained her attention position, uncertain how to respond. She had defended herself appropriately, but the results had exceeded everyone's expectations. "I understand, ma'am. I was following the exercise parameters as presented." Hayes nodded slowly, clearly considering the broader implications of what had just occurred. Morrison was a respected instructor with an exemplary record, but his conduct during the exercise had been unprofessional and potentially dangerous. "Your technique was exceptional," Hayes continued. "Your restraint was equally impressive. These qualities will serve you well in special operations." The words carried more weight than their simple meaning suggested. Hayes was not merely complimenting Maria's performance. She was indicating that the incident would not derail her career prospects. Word of Maria's confrontation with Sergeant Morrison spread through the training compound faster than classified intelligence. By evening, every instructor, support staff member, and candidate knew the basic details. The small woman from Los Angeles had systematically dismantled one of the military's most respected close-quarters combat experts. The story grew with each retelling. Some versions had Morrison unconscious for several minutes. Others claimed that Maria had used secret martial arts techniques learned from ninja masters. A few suggested that the entire incident was staged to demonstrate advanced combat principles. Maria ignored the whispered conversations and speculative glances. She had learned long ago that reputation was built through consistent performance, not single dramatic moments. The real test would come in the days and weeks that followed, when instructors either validated her abilities or found ways to undermine her progress. The next morning brought unexpected developments. Colonel Hayes summoned Maria to her office before dawn. An unusual request that suggested significant consequences were about to unfold. The command building was quiet at that hour, with most personnel still preparing for morning physical training. Maria reported precisely on time, her uniform immaculate and her bearing respectful, despite her uncertainty about the meeting's purpose. "Sit down, Santos," Hayes said without preamble. Her office was spartanly decorated, with commendations and unit photographs covering one wall and operational maps dominating another. The overall impression was of a professional who had devoted her entire career to military excellence. "Yesterday's incident has created several complications," Hayes began, reviewing a thick folder that presumably contained Maria's complete service record. "Sergeant Morrison filed a formal complaint alleging that you used unauthorized techniques during a training exercise." Maria felt her stomach tighten. Morrison's complaint could derail her special operations aspirations and potentially end her military career entirely. Charges of using unauthorized combat techniques were serious, particularly when they involved injuring a superior officer. "However," Hayes continued, closing the folder and leaning back in her chair, "my investigation revealed several interesting facts. First, Morrison deviated from approved training protocols when he personally entered the exercise. Second, his verbal provocations crossed the line from professional instruction to personal harassment. Third, your defensive actions were entirely appropriate, given the circumstances." The relief Maria felt was immediately tempered by caution. Military investigations were complex affairs where political considerations often outweighed simple facts. "Furthermore," Hayes said, opening a different folder, "your performance throughout the training program has been exceptional. Your written examinations rank in the top 5%. Your physical fitness scores exceed male standards consistently. Your leadership evaluations from peer candidates are uniformly positive." Hayes paused to study Maria's expression before continuing. "These factors, combined with yesterday's demonstration, have attracted attention from higher command levels. There are people who believe you represent exactly the kind of innovative thinking that special operations requires." The implication was clear, but Maria waited for Hayes to state it explicitly rather than making assumptions that could prove embarrassing. "The Department of Defense is implementing new programs designed to identify and develop unconventional talent," Hayes explained. "They're looking for personnel who can succeed in environments where traditional approaches have failed." Quote, She stood and moved to the window overlooking the training compound, where the morning's first candidates were beginning their physical fitness evaluations. "Your background is unusual for special operations. East Los Angeles is not typically considered a breeding ground for elite military personnel. But that unconventional background may be exactly what modern operations require." Maria remained silent, sensing that Hayes was building toward something significant. "I'm recommending you for accelerated advancement through the remaining training phases," Hayes announced, turning back toward her desk. "You'll complete the program in 6 weeks, rather than the standard 12. The proposal was almost unprecedented. Special operations training was deliberately extended to allow thorough evaluation of candidates under sustained pressure. Accelerating the process suggested extraordinary confidence in Maria's abilities. Additionally," Hayes continued, You'll be assigned to a specialized unit that focuses on unconventional warfare scenarios. The kind of missions where your particular skill set could prove invaluable. Maria finally spoke. What about Sergeant Morrison, ma'am? Hayes's expression hardened slightly. Sergeant Morrison has been reassigned to administrative duties, pending a comprehensive review of his training methodologies. His personal conduct yesterday was unprofessional and potentially dangerous. The news surprised Maria. Morrison was a decorated combat veteran, whose experience had trained dozens of successful special operations personnel. His reassignment represented a significant career setback that could effectively end his advancement prospects. I want you to understand something, Hayes said seriously. What happened yesterday was not about gender politics or social experimentation. It was about identifying exceptional talent and ensuring that personal prejudices don't prevent the military from utilizing its best resources. She returned to her chair and opened Maria's service record again. Your father served with distinction in Afghanistan. His sacrifice earned him the respect of everyone who worked with him. You've inherited his courage and determination, but you've also developed skills that complement his legacy. Hayes pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the desk toward Maria. This is your new assignment. You'll report to Colonel James Mitchell at Fort Bragg next Monday. He commands a unit that doesn't officially exist and conducts operations that never appear in any reports. Maria examined the orders, noting the minimal details and classified designation codes that indicated highly sensitive activities. Colonel Mitchell specifically requested you after reviewing the incident reports from yesterday, Hayes continued. Apparently, your combination of technical skills and psychological resilience matches exactly what his unit requires for upcoming operations. The implications were staggering. Maria had entered special operations training, hoping to prove that she deserved equal consideration with her male counterparts. Instead, she was being fast-tracked into assignments that most candidates would never have the opportunity to attempt. There's one more thing, Hayes said, her tone becoming more personal. Yesterday's incident will follow you throughout your career. Some people will always remember you as the woman who embarrassed a respected instructor. Others will see you as someone who proved that conventional assumptions about physical limitations are outdated. She leaned forward, her expression intense. How people remember you depends entirely on what you do next. One dramatic moment doesn't define a career, but it can create opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist. Maria nodded, understanding the broader implications of Hayes's advice. Yesterday's confrontation had opened doors, but walking through them successfully would require sustained excellence over time. Thank you, ma'am. I won't disappoint you. Hayes smiled for the first time since Maria had entered the office. I don't think disappointment is possible. Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished. 3 hours later, Maria found herself standing in front of the remaining training candidates as Colonel Hayes addressed the group. Morrison's absence was conspicuous, though no official explanation had been provided for his sudden replacement. Yesterday's events demonstrate several important principles, Hayes announced to the assembled personnel. First, special operations requires personnel who can adapt to unexpected circumstances. Second, traditional assumptions about physical limitations may not apply in modern combat environments. Her eyes found Maria among the group. Third, exceptional performance demands exceptional recognition. Hayes produced a set of orders and called Maria forward. Candidate Santos, you are hereby advanced to Phase 4 training status, effective immediately. Your performance throughout this program has been exemplary, and your potential for special operations service is unlimited. The announcement created a stir among the watching candidates. Advancing multiple training phases was virtually unprecedented, particularly for someone who had been in the program for such a short time. Furthermore, Hayes continued, Santos will be joining a specialized unit that focuses on unconventional warfare scenarios. Her assignment represents recognition of exceptional talent and dedication. As Maria accepted her new orders, she noticed the expressions of her fellow candidates. Some showed genuine admiration for her achievements. Others displayed resentment at what they perceived as preferential treatment. A few seemed simply stunned by the rapid turn of events. Let this serve as an example, Hayes addressed the group. Excellence is always recognized, regardless of its source. The military needs personnel who can overcome obstacles that others consider insurmountable. After the formation was dismissed, several candidates approached Maria privately. Thompson, one of the men she had defeated during the hand-to-hand combat exercise, was among the first. "That was incredible yesterday," he said with genuine respect. "I've been training for 5 years, and I've never seen anyone handle Morrison like that." Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "The way you used his momentum against him. Where did you learn techniques like that?" Maria appreciated their interest but remained cautious about sharing too many details. "My father taught me that size and strength matter, but intelligence and preparation matter more." Over the following days, as news of her assignment spread beyond the training compound, Maria received calls from family members who had learned about her advancement through military channels. Her father's former Marine colleagues reached out to offer congratulations and share stories about his service in Afghanistan. The most meaningful contact came from her father himself. When she called to share the news of her assignment, his reaction was immediate and emotional. "Mija," he said, using the childhood nickname that always made her feel connected to her roots. "You've done something that most people thought was impossible." His pride was evident in his voice, but she could also hear the concern that came from his understanding of what special operations assignments actually entailed. "Your mother is worried about the danger," he continued. "But I told her that you've been preparing for this your entire life. The neighborhood taught you to be tough. The Marine Corps taught you to be professional. Now you're going to show everyone what our family is capable of." As Maria prepared for her departure to Fort Bragg, she reflected on the chain of events that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been just another hopeful candidate trying to prove herself worthy of special operations training. Yesterday's confrontation with Morrison had changed everything, creating opportunities that exceeded her highest expectations. But she also understood that yesterday's success was only the beginning. Colonel Mitchell's unit would present challenges that made training exercises seem trivial by comparison. Real operations meant real consequences, where failure could cost lives, and success might never be publicly acknowledged. On her final morning at the training compound, Maria packed her gear with methodical precision. Everything she owned fit into a single duffel bag, reflecting the minimalist lifestyle that military service demanded. As she prepared to leave, she took one last look at the training area where her confrontation with Morrison had unfolded. The equipment rack had been repaired. The mats had been replaced. And new candidates were already beginning their evaluations. The physical space showed no signs of what had transpired there. But Maria understood that the impact would resonate for years. Future female candidates would face different expectations because of what had happened on that mat. Some would benefit from the precedent she had established, while others might face increased scrutiny from instructors determined to prove that her success was an anomaly. Either way, the military had been forced to acknowledge that its assumptions about physical limitations needed revision. Traditional standards remained important, but exceptional individuals could succeed through alternative approaches that complemented rather than replaced conventional methods. As Maria walked toward the transport that would take her to Fort Bragg, she thought about her father's advice from years earlier. Respect was earned through action, not given through sympathy. Yesterday, she had earned the respect of people who mattered. Tomorrow, she would begin proving that their confidence was justified. The future stretched ahead with all its uncertainties and possibilities. But for the first time since beginning special operations training, Maria felt confident that she belonged exactly where she was going. "Thank you, ma'am." Hayes turned to address the remaining candidates, who had watched the entire confrontation with varying degrees of shock and admiration. "Today's exercise demonstrates that special operations demands more than physical strength or conventional thinking. It requires adaptation, intelligence, and the courage to overcome obstacles that others consider insurmountable." Her eyes returned to Maria. "Some people rise to meet exceptional challenges. Others create excuses for their limitations. Today, you've seen both examples. Special operations isn't about winning training exercises," he said. "It's about doing whatever it takes to complete the mission. No matter who gets hurt. No matter what it costs." Then he attacked again. This time with the full fury of 15 years of combat experience behind every movement.